Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty together again. Chances are, while you listen to the classic nursery rhyme Humpty Dumpty, you picture some sort of egg-like man seated atop a wall before falling and shattering. But have you ever wondered why we assume Humpty Dumpty was an egg, when the rhyme itself doesn't mention a shell or yolk or any other egg-like attribute? And if they're not an egg, what on earth are they? And why did their fall elicit help from the king? The origins of nursery rhymes are often dark, debated, and shrouded in mystery. Humpty Dumpty first appeared in print in 1797, sounding slightly different to the version we know today. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. 80 men and 80 more could not make Humpty Dumpty where he was before. An 1810 edition of the foundational nursery rhyme collection, Gamma Gurton's Garland, included a similar version, this time 80 men coming to the aid of Humpty Dumpty. It wasn't until 3 years later that the king's horses joined them in print. Still, their emergence became the backbone of one of the most prevalent origin stories about the nursery rhyme. Some folklorists believe that Humpty Dumpty tells the story of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. In case you need a refresher on British monarchs, Richard III was the one immortalised by Shakespeare as a cruel, child-murdering monster. He came to power when his brother, Edward IV, died suddenly in 1483. Edward's sons, Edward V and Prince Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, were just 12 and 9 at the time of the monarch's death. Less than ideal ages for stepping into power. When Richard heard of his brother's untimely demise, he raced to London to pledge allegiance to his new king and act as Lord Protector until young Edward V could be crowned. Richard placed the young king and the prince in the Tower of London, which was the traditional residence of monarchs before the coronation. But shortly after, Richard indefinitely postponed the ceremony and rallied supporters to declare him the legitimate heir to the throne of England. Parliament declared both princes illegitimate, passing an act stating that Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville's marriage was invalid because of Edward's pre-contract of marriage with Lady Eleanor Butler. The act also claimed that Elizabeth Woodville and her mother had used witchcraft to get the king to marry her, and hinted that the princes, both of whom were born abroad, were illegitimate children. The boy's uncle was crowned King Richard III of England on July 6, 1483. After he ascended to the throne, the deposed King Edward V and Prince Richard were moved to the inner apartments of the Tower and then seen less and less until they disappeared altogether. There are no reported sightings of the boys after the summer of 1483, and their fate remains a mystery. The most popular theory about the princes in the Tower is that Richard III ordered them murdered to protect his claim to the throne. Sir James Tyrrell even confessed to smothering the two boys with pillows and then burying them at the foot of the stairs before reburying them elsewhere on Richard's command. That confession became the basis for Shakespeare's Richard III. But other theories suggest that the new king was not responsible for the boy's death, and that a party with other political ambitions, either hoping to please the king or dispute his rule, arranged the murder. In one theory, Lady Margaret Beaufort arranged for the princes to be secretly killed or hidden to arouse distrust in the king. She could then safely propose her own son as a candidate. The prince's supporters would follow, sealed with the promise that her child, Henry Tudor, would marry the prince's sister, Elizabeth of York. Either way, the disappearance of two young royals under his watch did not endear Richard III to many. Seizing on the lack of support for the king, Henry Tudor laid his own claim to the throne, sparking the War of the Roses, the civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York that engulfed much of England for the latter part of the 15th century. In 1485, Henry Tudor successfully marched toward London, gathering supporters along the way. Henry met Richard near Ambion Hill, south of Market Bosworth, where Richard had mustered his troops, hoping to quash his opponent's kingly ambitions before he made it to Parliament. Richard's army of over 10,000 greatly outnumbered Henry Tudor's forces by at least 2-1. But a third army of 6,000, led by the wealthy Stanley family, had yet to choose a side. Richard had kidnapped the eldest Stanley's son as a hostage to force the family to side with him. But, unsurprisingly, this did little to endear the family to his cause. At Bosworth, Richard III divided his army into 3 groups and placed them strategically atop Ambion Hill. Henry kept his army together, moving through the marsh underneath. Meanwhile, the Stanleys watched the battle unfold from the sidelines, waiting to see which side would win. The two opposing armies met in a bloody clash on the moors, with Richard himself running straight into battle. But despite their numbers, Richard's forces lacked the fervour of their opponents. When the king's standard-bearer had his legs hacked off from under him, panic and fear took hold, and Henry's men gained the upper hand. Seeing the tide turn, Richard called for Stanley's troops to come to his aid. When they didn't, Richard's troops begged for him to withdraw. The king refused, seeing a final chance to secure victory by personally slaying Henry himself, who was hiding among the back rows of his army. Richard and his knights mounted a charge, coming within feet of Henry Tudor. Seeing the king and his most trusted men separate from the rest of the army, the Stanleys made their decision. They rushed Richard's charge, knocked him from his horse, and struck a death blow with a halberd. Later analysis of Richard's remains would show 9 wounds to the head, including one that sliced off the rear of his skull. What does all of this have to do with a children's nursery rhyme? Well, it's believed that Richard III had a spinal deformity, which left him with a hunched appearance. Humpty Dumpty may have been a callous nickname for the king. In 15th century England, the term was a common snarky descriptor of someone fat, clumsy, or disabled. In this origin story, Humpty Dumpty's wool refers to the horse King Richard rode into battle, which legend suggests was named Wool, or affectionately referred to as the Wall by Richard for his steadfast manner in battle. And while this is an amusing theory of the origin of Humpty Dumpty, there are more than a few problems with it, not least the fact that there are some 300 years between the Battle of Bosworth Field and the first known appearance of the nursery rhyme. While it is not impossible that the rhyme survived in oral tradition until it was printed, it's not likely. Plus, the oldest rhyme versions don't mention kings or horses. Perhaps the rhyme itself changed to better encompass this popular origin story, or maybe any parallels between Humpty Dumpty and Richard III are mere coincidences that amateur folklorists have moulded to create a more compelling narrative. An alternative theory ties the rhyme's origins to a different English Civil War, this one from 1642 until 1651. According to some military historians, during the conflict, a large cannon nicknamed Humpty Dumpty was stationed on the fortified walls of Colchester to protect the city from parliamentary forces. But during the battle, the cannon fell from the wall and was shattered. Ultimately, Colchester and the king's men who held it fell to Parliament, ushering in the era of Oliver Cromwell's stint as Lord Protector. Whether the rhyme refers to Richard III, the Colchester cannon, or was invented as pure nonsense, we have Lewis Carroll to thank for the egg-like Humpty Dumpty we know today. In 1871, Carroll's Through the Looking Glass features a chapter titled Humpty Dumpty, in which Alice meets the strange character, which read in part, "The egg only got larger and larger and more human. When she had come within a few yards of it, she saw that it had eyes and a nose and a mouth, and when she had come close to it, she saw clearly that it was Humpty Dumpty himself. It can't be anyone else. I'm as certain of it as if his name were written all over his face." While this was the first instance Humpty Dumpty was depicted as an odd mix of egg and human, it's possible that Carroll drew his inspiration from the way the nursery rhyme was often printed during its early days as a riddle, in which the solution was an egg. At the time of its printing, eggs were kept not in the refrigerator or a special carton, but on a shelf or a windowsill. Lewis Carroll likely understood this use of the rhyme and used it as inspiration, with Alice reimagining an ordinary egg on a shelf as an egg-shaped man on a wall in her dream. While this origin story is far less exciting than Richard falling to Henry Tudor or the collapse of a wall around Colchester, it makes more sense. After all, it explains why Humpty Dumpty is not explicitly stated to be an egg in the rhyme. That's not how riddles work. It would give away the answer. Though less well known to American children than Humpty Dumpty, this next nursery rhyme has rumoured ties to another well-known British monarch. Dr. Foster went to Gloucester in a shower of rain. He stepped in a puddle up to his middle and never went there again. According to some folklorists, the origins of Dr. Foster lie in English history dating back to the Plantagenet monarch of the 13th century, King Edward I of England, also known as Edward Longshanks and Hammer of the Scots. Yes, that one. He reigned from 1272 to 1307. Edward's longest-lasting political contributions included the birth of the English Parliament, codifying the legal system and various administrative reforms that shaped the future of the crown. But while away from home, he was a warrior. Despite the poor nutrition and inadequate health care that left most monarchs far smaller and sicklier than their official portraits depict, he grew to an astonishing 6 feet 2 inches. With the average man topping out just over 5 feet tall, Edward cut an imposing figure that lent itself well to his campaign of conquest. During the early years of his reign, Edward spent much time responding to uprisings in Wales, ultimately invading the area in 1277, building castles to demonstrate his power in the region after defeating Welsh leader Llewellyn ap Gruffydd. When rebellion reared its head in 1282, Edward invaded again, killing Gruffydd in battle and ordering his brother David to be executed, effectively ending Welsh hopes of independence. Edward's son was proclaimed the Prince of Wales to solidify his rule over the region, a tradition that persists to this day. Later, Edward invaded Scotland, imprisoned their king, and put the Scottish people under English rule. His successful wars expanded the crown's power and earned him a reputation as an influential, commanding monarch. But he was less popular amongst, say, Scots and Welsh, who didn't relish falling under his rule. Perhaps nothing is more satisfying than the image of a powerful enemy languishing in the mud. According to some, this image is the root of the Dr. Foster rhyme. In this origin story, Edward I was en route to Wales to wreak havoc and build castles when he passed through Gloucester. The nickname Doctor referred to Edward's status as a learned man, with Foster added for simple rhyming purposes. When he arrived in strategically important Gloucester, the imposing conqueror misjudged the size of a puddle and fell from his horse into the mud. The townspeople used wood planks to rescue Edward and his horse from the muck, leaving the king in a most undignified position. According to legend, Edward was so angry and humiliated that he vowed to never return to Gloucester again. Edward's critics immortalised his embarrassment into rhyme, singing the verse to show their displeasure with his rule. Like Humpty Dumpty, the earliest version of this rhyme looked a bit different when it first appeared in Gamma Gurton's Garland 1810 collection. That version read, "Old Dr. Foster went to Gloucester to preach the word of God. When he came there, he sat in his chair and gave all of the people a nod." This obviously cannot refer to King Edward I. It's believed it may be a reference to a representative of William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was sent to Gloucester with instructions to move the communion tables to the east end of the church. Post-Reformation, the tables had been put in the middle of the chancel, but Protestant King Charles I tasked Laud with remodelling the church to impose uniformity on the Church of England. Laud and his representatives conducted intrusive visits to parish churches to ensure every aspect of his aesthetic policies were in place and punish nonconformists. Ultimately, Laud was beheaded on Tower Hill in 1645 after being found guilty of high treason. Some folklorists believe the 1810 version of Dr. Foster was a reminder of Laud's overstep. Yet another origin theory suggests that Dr. Foster refers to the 16th century play The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus. The Elizabethan tragedy written by Christopher Marlowe was based on a German folktale about Johann Faust, or John Faustus in English. Faust makes a deal with the devil at the crossroads, trading his soul for unlimited knowledge and pleasure. In Marlowe's play, Faustus is called Dr. Foster after he uses magic to change straw into a horse, which he sells to a horse courser, warning the man not to ride the animal into the water. The courser reappears sopping wet, having ridden his new horse into a stream where it turned into a heap of straw. The legend of Faust has gone on to serve as inspiration for literally hundreds of works of literature, music, art, and cinema. Perhaps Dr. Foster was just an early example of its influence. While Dr. Foster's possible dark ties to deals with the devil are well disguised by a verse generally interpreted as a warning to beware of any water you can't see the bottom of, other nursery rhymes are less soothing when the words are examined. Chances are, at some point in your childhood, you were rocked to sleep as an adult sang. Rock-a-bye baby on the treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. And down will come baby, cradle and all. Without melody, the rhyme is downright morbid. Why would a parent sing about a cradle toppling from a tree, sending their beloved baby toppling to the ground below? The rhyme that became one of the best-known lullabies in the world was printed in the book Mother Goose's Melody in 1765, with the footnote, "This may serve as a warning to the proud and ambitious who climb so high that they generally fall at last." While you would assume such a clear explanation of the meaning of the simple rhyme would put other explanations to bed, this isn't the case. Unsurprisingly, monarchs and religion find themselves thrown into the mix once more. Some theorists believe Rock-a-bye Baby was first written in response to King James II's conversion to Catholicism. When James had a son in 1688, many feared the heir would create a Catholic dynasty in England. In this theory, the words in Rock-a-bye Baby are a wish for the infant to die so that he might be replaced by a Protestant king. In a similar theory, the wind may represent the Protestant movement, with the breaking bough symbolising the Stuart monarchy and the baby in danger being England itself. In the early 20th century, British writer Gerald Massey wrote in his book Ancient Egypt that he believed the nursery rhyme referred to the deity Horus. Horus is typically depicted as a falcon or a man with the head of a falcon, and it was believed that his right eye was the sun, representing power and quintessence, and his left eye was the moon, representing healing. Exactly how Horus made his way into a Western nursery rhyme is not explained by Massey, and the theory was overshadowed by others. A more popular origin theory for the rhyme attributes authorship to a young pilgrim who observed an Indigenous father hang a birch bark cradle from a branch of a tree. In recent years, a viral copy-pasta shared on social media claimed that the author was not a pilgrim child, but Effie Crockett, the older sister of Davy Crockett. According to the story, Effie was invited to help some mothers in the Muskogee tribe, where she observed their custom of hanging their papooses in the birch trees to protect their babies from insects, sun, and wild animals as they went about their work. Effie overheard a Muskogee mother singing to the children and later translated the words of the lullaby to English, giving us Rockabye Baby. In this telling, the mothers used the breaking bough as an analogy for their babies growing up. One day, the branch would break because the baby would grow too heavy, and the papoose, along with its baby, would fall to the ground, signaling it was time to grow into adulthood. This proposed origin story struck a chord with many, but sadly has no academic merit. Effie Crockett was born about a century after Rockabye Baby was first published and had no known links to the legendary American frontiersman Davy Crockett, who lived from 1786 to 1836. Effie Crockett does have a connection to the rhyme, though. She composed the melody that pulled the nursery rhyme off the pages of Mother Goose and into rocking chairs everywhere. When she was about 15, her family visited Winthrop, Massachusetts. And while she was reading on a piazza, she noticed a baby crying after his mother had set him down on a hammock. The teen attempted to soothe the infant by improvising a melody while singing words she recalled from a book of nursery rhymes. She took her new song to her banjo teacher, who connected her with a Boston publisher. Seeking anonymity, Effie published the song under the name Effie Canning in 1886. The tune was used in a scene of the play The Old Homestead, and sheet music sales reached $20,000 within months. Sadly, Effie received few royalties from the song and died in poverty. A true story that adds even more sadness to the melancholy nature of Rockabye Baby. Nearly a century after Rockabye Baby first appeared in print, James Orchard Halliwell published his own collection of rhymes titled Nursery Rhymes of England in 1842. The collection included a rhyme that had been very popular in Great Britain and America for at least a few decades, and it read, Lucy Locket lost her pocket, Kitty Fisher found it. Not a penny was there in it, but a ribbon round it. Most modern appearances of Lucy Locket feature an illustration of two young girls, one bending to retrieve the small purse dropped by her companion. At the time of Lucy Locket's rise in popularity, pockets were not the slits sewn into clothing we're familiar with, nor was it another term for a woman's handbag. Pockets were square or pear-shaped pouches with a vertical opening worn tied around a woman's waist. A woman could access her pocket through openings in her dress and petticoats, but the pocket itself often remained hidden under her clothing. Women had few places to safely store valuable or precious items, and it was not unusual for a pocket to contain everything from simple household tools like needles, scissors, and pencils to sentimental objects like miniature portraits and locks of hair. Pockets could also conceal secrets like letters from a lover, small sweets, and ornate small valuables. A woman's pocket was hers alone, perhaps the only few inches of the world that was truly private. As you can imagine, losing a pocket and having it returned utterly empty was not the stuff of silly rhymes. While the identity of Lucy Locket and what her pocket may have contained is a mystery, one theory of the rhyme's origins involves the real Kitty Fisher. Catherine Maria Fisher, better known as Kitty, was the most celebrated courtesan of the 18th century. Kitty was born into a poor family in 1741, but was introduced to London's high society in her teens, quickly becoming known for her affairs with wealthy, powerful men. Above all, Kitty was a master of publicity. During one famous incident, she fell from her horse in St. James's Park, accidentally exposing herself in the process. Overnight, broadsheets mocked her as the fallen woman who fell. Yes, we can all see what they did there. But instead of hiding in embarrassment, Kitty seized on fame by having her portrait painted by Joshua Reynolds, the most prominent painter in England. Kitty Fisher became one of the first celebrities to be famous simply for being famous, known widely for her charm, beauty, wit, and reputation. Prints of her portraits were handed about among men. Women both criticised and copied her fashions, and artists and writers immortalised her in their works. Kitty married a prestigious son of an MP, but sadly died just months later at the age of just 25. By then, no one knew if the stories about her, like when she ate a £1,000 banknote on bread and butter, were true or just part of her carefully constructed public persona. But there was no doubt that Kitty was an incredibly successful courtesan with a very good or bad reputation depending on who you asked. Some folklorists believe that Lucy Locket was another courtesan in the 1760s and had a terrible rivalry with Kitty Fisher, leading to the creation of a rhyme about the pair. However, as often as Kitty Fisher's name was cemented in historical records, no evidence of a Lucy Locket in Charles II's court exists. Another interpretation of the myth is that Lucy was a barmaid at the Cock Public House in Fleet Street, and the rhyme is meant to show the disparity in wealth between poor Lucy Locket and wealthy, beautiful Kitty Fisher. A more sinister twist on this origin story asserts that Lucy also engaged in sex work, had a regular customer known as a pocket who ran out of money and was dumped by the barmaid. The man then turned his attention to Kitty, who rejected the penniless man and taunted Lucy for her involvement with him. Other versions of the myth are more literal, with Kitty stealing money from the barmaid. But given that Kitty Fisher's portrait hangs in the National Gallery and she was buried in a ball gown, I like to think she would have left the poor barmaid be. Many nursery rhymes naturally slightly change as time evolves, words here and there being replaced as their meanings change. Others have dropped from print completely due to having problematic content. While it's easy to imagine that this is a modern occurrence, truth is, people have been tweaking and changing these rhymes for longer than you might imagine. One of the earliest and most famous to face changes was Little Robin Redbreast. The modern version reads in part, "Little Robin Redbreast sat upon a rail. Niddle noddle went his head, wiggle waggle went his tail." Now, the original depraved version goes thusly. Little Robin Redbreast sitting on a pole. Niddle noddle went his head, and poop went his hole. This early version dates back to the mid-18th century, with the poop-free version replacing it just a few decades later. The Victorian era, as wild as it often seems, saw the introduction of the Society for Nursery Rhyme reform, which viewed many common couplets as harbouring unsavoury elements. In the 1940s, the cause was taken up by Yorkshire businessman Geoffrey Hall, who founded the True Aim movement for nursery rhyme reform to rewrite nursery rhymes that contained references to violence or unhappiness. For instance, Hall's version of Three Blind Mice became Three Kind Mice. The old woman who lived in a shoe, who had so many children she didn't know what to do, instead had so many children and loved them all too. Hall published his works and new nursery rhymes for old in 1949. Among the poems Hall reworked was Ding Dong Bell. In its most common version, the rhyme reads, Ding Dong Bell, pussy's in the well. Who put her in? Little Johnny Green. Who pulled her out? Little Tommy Stout. Hall believed this rhyme would tempt children to put cats in wells themselves and rewrote it as Ding Dong Bell, pussy's at the well. Who took her there? Little Johnny Hare. Who'll bring her in? Little Tommy Thin. What a jolly boy was that to get some milk for Pussycat, who ne'er did any harm, but played with the mice in his father's barn. Well, blow me down if Hall's versions of the rhymes failed to catch on, but he was determined to prove that existing nursery rhymes were simply too terrible to remain in print. In 1952, True Aim published a selected bibliography of literature related to nursery rhyme reform, compiled by noted bibliographer and fellow reformer Geoffrey Handley Taylor. The booklet claimed the average collection of 200 traditional nursery rhymes contains approximately 100 rhymes which personify all that is glorious and ideal for the child. Unfortunately, the remaining 100 rhymes harbour unsavoury elements. This claim was followed by a list of so-called unsavoury incidents, including 8 allusions to murder, 14 cases of stealing and dishonesty, 23 cases of physical violence, 9 allusions to poverty and want, 5 instances of quarrelling, 1 mention of undertakers, 1 case of kidnapping, 9 instances of children being lost or abandoned, and 1 allusion to a bleeding heart. Hall said in an interview with International News Service, "How can we expect to instill tolerance, kindness, and good citizenship in our youngsters if they are brought up on this sort of material almost from their mother's knee?" Many authorities are blaming the more fanciful type of American comics and gangster films for the present-day increase in juvenile crime. But it goes much deeper than that. It's those nursery rhymes. Most publishers and reviewers generally agreed with Hall's assessment that classic nursery rhymes were violent compared to Hall's new versions. However, the reformers struggled to convince the populace that classic nursery rhymes were bad for children or inspired violence. Other reform movements at the same time had more effectively captured the public's attention. Psychiatrist Dr. Frederick Wortham waged a successful campaign against comic books, despite most other experts disagreeing with his claims that comics were a significant contributing factor to the rise in juvenile delinquency. Even FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover joined Workman in pushing for comic reform, and in 1954, a U.S. Senate subcommittee met for hearings on the so-called comic book menace. Wortham himself testified in front of the Senate group saying, "I think Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry. They get the children much younger." While the subcommittee ultimately rejected the notion of government censorship of comics, the damage was done. Public scrutiny and the threat of federal legislation led to major publishers forming the Comic Magazine Association of America to self-regulate their industry. The association issued a comics code that included regulations like no comics shall explicitly present the unique details and methods of a crime, and policemen, judges, government officials, and respected institutions shall never be presented in such a way as to create disrespect for established authority. While comic books were a relatively new phenomenon and easier to ascribe blame for current trends to, nursery rhymes had been around for centuries, and convincing the public they were responsible for the current so-called crime wave was much more challenging. Ultimately, True Aim's bid at reform floundered, and Geoffrey Hall's cleaned-up versions of nursery rhymes were never republished. The three blind mice still lose their tails to a carving knife. Humpty Dumpty remains in pieces, and the baby's cradle is still placed atop a tree. And with an ever-evolving list of new media to blame for violence and crime, these classic rhymes are unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care. And I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.